Studies, or the Department of Religion at Temple University. Before I introduce her talk and bring her up here, I did want to tell you a little bit about her and her scholarship. I should note that you can follow her on Twitter at Nyasha Junior. It's just her name after the @ sign. And she's prolific on Twitter, but is also an incredible academic and scholar who we are going to be able to hear a little bit from her forthcoming book tonight. Her alma mater is Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She got her MPA at Princeton University and her MDiv at Pacific School of Religion. She got her PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary in Hebrew Bible. And is now in the Department of Religion at Temple University in Philadelphia. Her debut book that you guys should have gotten a little bit of literature on is an introduction to womanist biblical interpretation. And it is an exceptional book. It is very accessible. I recommend it for those who want to understand a little bit more about womanism is and what it isn't. And the book that she will be talking about tonight is her forthcoming book from Oxford University Press, which you can now pre-order. And if you've gotten the literature, you can get 30% off of as well, which is called Reimagining Hagar, Blackness and Bible. I should say that after this book, I look very much forward to the one after it as well, which is called Black Samson, The Untold Story of an American Icon. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Junior to you to talk a little bit about Black Like Me, representation of biblical.
Okay. I will just try really hard to project, and some of you can move up as well. There are plenty of seats in the front. Okay? So special thanks to Dr. Bond for organizing this event, and also thank you to the Kaplan family and to the many departments that pulled together to co-sponsor this event. Before we get started, I do want to mention a couple of things. As Dr. Bond mentioned, I'm active on Twitter. And so my handle is NYASHAJUNIOR. And I've been tweeting about this project at REHAGAR. So you can use the hashtag #ReHagar to follow the conversation and also to add to it. There is a handout available for those of you in the room. It has the text of Genesis 16 and 21 and also a couple of additional resources. For others, there's also an electronic version, and that's at bit.ly/Junior Iowa. So you can also find the same handout available electronically at Junior Iowa under Bitly. So my topic for this evening is Black Like Me, representations of Biblical Hagar. And this is a slice of my project, which is Reimagining Hagar, Blackness, and Bible. And the book should be out this summer, maybe June-ish. We will see. I've turned in all of my stuff to the press, so we'll see how long it takes them. So in our time together, I really want to just provide a little bit of background about the project and how I got started, and share a little bit more about biblical texts on Hagar, and then some of the representations of Biblical Hagar. So first, Oscars So White. Oscars So White is a campaign that was founded by April Rain. Some of you may have seen it on Twitter. She created the hashtag and subsequent campaign in 2015 in response to the lack of diversity at the Oscars. In 2015, all of the nominees for lead and supporting actor categories were white. The Oscars So White campaign is not simply to increase the number of black awardees, but to work toward increasing the number of people of color in the film industry at all levels. So that includes actors, but also directors, editors, lighting designers, and others. The images that we see on screen are powerful, and representation matters in literature, film, television, and even in commercials. We all need to see images that represent the diversity in our world. Related to issues of diversity and inclusion in Hollywood have also come charges of whitewashing in the film industry. So in film, whitewashing involves casting white actors to play roles for characters who were originally identified as persons of color. So for example, some of you may have seen Ghost in the Shell. Anybody? Okay. This is a film that faced charges of whitewashing. So Scarlett Johansson, here on the screen, is a Danish-American actor who stars in the film. There have been different adaptations of this, but Ghost in the Shell was the first live-action film adaptation. Johansson plays the Major in the film, and fans of the series have complained that the character is really a Japanese woman. But instead of choosing a Japanese woman for the part, a white woman was selected. Thus, they argue that this is whitewashing the film. When we turn from the Oscars to the Bible, we know that the Bible is not white. And what I mean by that is the characters in biblical texts are not white according to our modern and flawed notions of biologically determined race. There's not a racial category of white in the ancient world. Certainly people understood that there were differences among people. So the ancients recognized that different people come from different geographic areas, that they have different languages, different customs, different beliefs, and even different physical features, including skin color. But our contemporary notions of reading the Bible are still influenced a lot by whiteness. So for example, some of us are old enough to remember Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 The Ten Commandments. For some of us, you're used to watching this maybe Easter weekend. In my family, this was something that we did pretty much every single year. This was, of course, before Netflix or DVRs, so you had to actually sit down and watch it when it came on annually. Starring Charlton Heston as Moses and Russian Yul Brynner as Ramses, this is considered a classic biblical epic. At the time of its release, it was one of the most expensive films ever made. In its portrayal of the biblical world, there just happened to not be any people of color, or at least not in major roles. So in most reinterpretations of biblical texts in film, whiteness is still the norm. The Bible, of course, is not white, and the Bible portrays a multicultural, multi-ethnic world. But like filmmakers, over time, many biblical interpreters have whitewashed the Bible. They usually are interpreting biblical characters or as white, as European, or just sort of generally beige, but not too brown. So when we think of characters like Moses or Adam or Noah, we tend to think of them as white, particularly because we've seen them perhaps in film. When you say something like, well, you know, Moses was Egyptian, people start to think, well, you know, that's a little different, but still that's not the same as like black, though. Even when you point out that Egypt is in Africa, people still have particular notions of what these characters look like because of the influence of film and art and culture. So, how does this lead to Hagar? When I was on the faculty at Howard University, I was teaching an Intro to Hebrew Bible course, and at some point we were talking about the Pentateuch, or Torah. And part of what I do in class is show students a lot of different images of biblical figures so that we can talk about what it is that they are imagining. So when you're reading, you're imagining something, but when you have something else to look at, it helps to make you aware of what you are thinking as you are reading. So in showing students different interpretations, the exercise is designed to make them more aware of how they generate images of biblical figures in their minds and to illustrate how much the text provides very few details about most of the people in the Bible. So, for example, I show them lots of paintings, including this 16th century image of Adam and Eve. So I'm not an art historian, so I just show the images, and then in class we talk about what do you see. So there's no right answer, but just observation. So students might point out that they see a serpent in the tree, that they thought the fig leaves would be a little bit bigger, that they are curious about the type of fruit, because we emphasize in class that it's not an apple that's specified in the text. I show them images like this, which is Joseph and Potiphar's wife. It's a rendering of Genesis 39. In the text, in Genesis, Joseph is described as handsome in form and appearance. But what does that actually look like? So when we look at this image, students said, well, I thought maybe he'd be sort of older, or I thought she would be a lot older. I wasn't sure about this sort of overcoat thing he has. I thought that would be different. So we just talk about what they see and how it's different from perhaps what they were thinking. This is a 20th century painting of the finding of Moses. We talk about Pharaoh's daughter and bathing rituals. So long ago when I was in college, we lived in dorms. I know that you all live in residence halls or apartments. But we used to have to like take a little, you'd have a little carrier and you'd take your toiletries down the hall to take a shower. I know this seems ridiculous because you have your suites and whatnot. But this is how it was. So I was thinking that Pharaoh's daughter had like maybe 1 or 2 people with her, somebody to carry all of her oils and lotions and potions, somebody to carry the towels, and they just went down to the water. I wasn't thinking that she had a whole entourage of people to go with her to take a bath. So the text doesn't specify, but by looking at the images, it helps you to flesh out the fact that you are thinking of something as you are reading. So at some point, I talked to my students about Genesis 16 and showed them an image similar to this. And the students were really shocked. And I said, well, is it due to Abraham's physique, perhaps? And the students asked, well, why is Hagar white? We all know that she's a black woman. I was surprised because they hadn't really expressed any objection to any of the other figures that we had talked about, like Adam and Eve or Moses or Joseph. So I was wondering how they might have this particular idea, So in this image, it's Hagar with Sarah, and she's being presented to Abraham. So this project really started because of my students and my curiosity, given that most of the time biblical texts are whitewashed, that we think of them often as white or European. How and why might we come to understand Hagar as black? So given that most of us think of biblical figures as white or picture them in our imaginations that way or see them that way frequently, where would this idea come from that this particular figure of Hagar might be thought of as a black woman? So, moving on to talk about Genesis 16 and 21. So you have a handout, and there's also an electronic one that has the texts. I'll just summarize for you quickly. You can read them later. So Hagar is a recognized figure within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as the wife of Abraham and also the mother of Ishmael. But she only appears in a couple of biblical texts and does not appear by name in the Quran. As you may know, God changes Abram's name to Abraham and changes Sarai's name to Sarah. Just for clarity, I'll call them Sarah and Abraham throughout. So again, just a quick summary. At this point in the book of Genesis, God has promised Abraham that he will be blessed with descendants. But his wife Sarah is unable to conceive. Sarah has the idea to give her Egyptian enslaved woman named Hagar to her husband and to use Hagar as a surrogate so that she can have a child by her. After 10 years, Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham as a wife. He has sex with her, she conceives, and bears a son, Ishmael. In chapter 21, after Sarah has miraculously given birth to Isaac, Hagar and Ishmael are kicked out of the house. There's a lot of drama in between, but that's roughly what happens. So Sarah has Hagar as her enslaved woman, and the text specifies that Hagar is an Egyptian, but it doesn't explain how she came into the household or how she came under Sarah's control. The text doesn't specify anything beyond the fact that she's an Egyptian, so we don't know how old she is, if she spoke a different language, if she wore a different type of clothes, if she physically looked different than they did, or had any other distinguishing characteristics. Sometimes I ask my students, do you think that maybe she had like Egyptian eyeliner that they all wear that you see? Or was there something about her that you knew that she was Egyptian? The text doesn't specify. Still, many interpreters think of her and have treated her as white, particularly within European art. So for example, this time we have a more beefy Abraham. And here he already has his hand a little Joe Biden-ish on Hagar. And Sarah is presenting Hagar to Abraham, who doesn't appear to be terribly reluctant in this scenario. In this image, this is Hagar and the angel. So Hagar here looks pretty young, almost like a teenager. And the angel or messenger also looks fairly young here in this situation. In Genesis 21, it also mentions that Hagar is Egyptian, but Hagar is getting thrown out of the house because Sarah now has her own child. So we see here, again, it's Sarah who's up front, who appears to be doing the kicking out. Abraham is kind of in the back, hanging back, and Sarah is pointing, and Hagar is the one who has to leave without even a backpack or a rollerboard. Here we have a rosy-cheeked Ishmael. The dog is often a sign of family loyalty, but they are the ones who are out and out of the house. And there's usually in images of Hagar some sort of water jug so that you know it's her and not some other random biblical female figure. This one you may recognize. Here we have a very distraught Hagar, and you see here to her left Ishmael, who is just kind of splayed out on the rock. And again, you have the empty water jug. So just from these few selections, you can see that Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah are usually depicted as fairly European. So given these representations that we often see, where might this idea come from of a black Hagar, and what purpose might it serve? I had never heard about the use of Hagar in this way until I was in my Master of Divinity program and read Dolores Williams' Sisters in the Wilderness. Womanist theologian Dolores Williams, who's at Union Theological Seminary in New York, her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk, was a groundbreaking bestseller within religious studies and related fields. Her work became a standard text in theology and remains on many syllabi and reading lists. Published in 1993, her book brought renewed attention to Biblical Hagar and to Black American appropriation of Hagar. Her book contributed to a resurgence of interest in Hagar, and in the book, Williams cites numerous instances of what she identifies as the African American appropriation of Hagar. This is an image of Williams, and she writes, quote, "For more than 100 years, Hagar, the African slave of Hebrew woman Sarah, has appeared in the deposits of African American culture. Sculptors, writers, poets, scholars, preachers, and just plain folk have passed along the biblical figure Hagar to generation after generation of black folks," end quote. This is the updated cover for her book. The book has two main parts. In the first part, Sisters in the Wilderness, Williams explores the Hagar narratives and addresses issues such as motherhood, surrogacy, racism and colorism, and black women's resistance strategies. In part two, Womanist God Talk, she offers a new theology, or what she calls a God Talk, that centers on black women's experiences and is more inclusive than the traditionally male-dominated black liberation theology. So in her work, she centers on black women's experiences as a source for theological reflection. She offers numerous parallels between the plight of Hagar and black women. She does not identify Hagar as black, but the connections that she makes would lead the reader to think of her as a black woman. So for example, Williams says, quote, "Hagar's heritage was African, as was black women's. Hagar was a slave. Black American women had emerged from a slave heritage and still lived in light of it," end quote. Williams also links black women's experiences with Sarah's abuse of Hagar. She doesn't identify Hagar as Abraham's wife, although the text does, but she does note that Abraham, quote, "ravished Hagar." Williams also compares the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael to the expulsion of black women with their children post-slavery. Furthermore, she identifies Hagar as a single mother. In her work, she cites a number of literary and cultural representations of a Hagar in arguing for this particular Hagar tradition within Black American culture. So she mentions Edmonia Lewis. This sculpture is called Hagar, or Hagar in the Wilderness, by African American and Native American artist Edmonia Lewis. Also, there is a Hagar figure in Langston Hughes' novel, Not Without Laughter, published in 1930. And there is a character named Hagar in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, which was published in 1977. So as I began to investigate this tradition that Williams was citing, I realized that what I was seeing was not a single tradition, but two different understandings of Hagar that had become fused into a single tradition. So what I noticed was there are allusions to biblical Hagar throughout U.S. literature. Similar to visual artists, playwrights, authors, and others emphasize particular parts of Hagar's narrative, usually portraying her as a white woman, but acknowledging some connection with the story of Hagar in Genesis. Over time, she morphs from white to sometimes a mixed race, or what they would call a mulatto woman, and also into a black woman character named Hagar. So, for example, there is a novel published in 1830 by Emma Dorothy Eliza Nevitt Southworth called The Deserted Wife, or Hagar, or The Deserted Wife. In this book, the main character is named Hagar, but she is a white woman. In the novel, she's regarded as dark, but her darkness here is not connected with blackness, but rather her, quote, dark, wild countenance. So in comparison with another character, she offers the contrast. She is fair, full-formed. I am small, thin, and dark. She is soft, gentle, sensitive. I am wild, fierce, and proud. So in the story, there's an allusion to biblical Hagar. The character says, "Yes, Hagar, that is my name, my fit name. What strange prophetic inspiration was it that made them drop my proper name of Agatha and call me Hagar?" So there are characters named Hagar that we see in U.S. literature, and sometimes there are allusions made to the biblical text. We also see this in Hagar's Daughter, a story of Southern caste prejudice, which was written by African-American writer Pauline Hopkins. In this story, we have a Hagar who is what's called a tragic mulatta. She discovers that she is not white as she has been raised to believe, but rather a mixed race woman whose mother had been enslaved. When she realizes this, she makes a connection to the biblical text and says, only this morning she was his wife, the honored mistress of his home. Tonight, what? Question mark. His slave, his concubine, horrible fatality that had named her Hagar. So the character notes the irony of her name by comparing her situation to that of biblical Hagar. Also in the modern Hagar, we have another mixed race woman who is named one thing but called Hagar. And in the novel, one of the women looks at an oil painting with Hagar as the subject and compares her situation to biblical Hagar. So there are a number of instances where we have figures who are named Hagar, understanding that there is a biblical Hagar.
I'm a digital humanist. Yeah.
That's
Cannot
okay.
figure out a microphone on the
That's all right. Okay, so there are different characters, sometimes named Hagar, and sometimes people make connections with her and the biblical text. There are still other types of Hagars who appear in literature and culture. So we see one of those in what's called Aunt Hagar figures. So if you've ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, there is an actual Uncle Tom figure in the book. There is also an Aunt Hagar figure that no one remembers. In this book, Hagar is portrayed as an enslaved African woman. Scholars have debated the immediate effect of Uncle Tom's Cabin on the U.S. Civil War. There's an apocryphal story that upon meeting Stowe, President Abraham Lincoln is claimed to have said, "You're the little lady who started the Great War." There's no evidence that this story was ever made, and it's in hindsight that many attribute such great influence to Stowe's work at the time of its publication. Still, it has become an extraordinarily important novel. So, along with the Uncle Tom, there's an Aunt Hagar who is an enslaved black woman. She's described as, quote, a regular African in feature and figure. Just as Uncle Tom is called Uncle due to his age, she is called Aunt Hagar. She is despondent when she is sold away from her son, and this Hagar, I would argue, is unrelated to a biblical Hagar. There's not a particular allusion to biblical Hagar. It's simply a name for a biblical character. Other works also include figures named Hagar. So as I've already mentioned, in Langston Hughes' work and in Toni Morrison's, we still see HAGAR'S who may not be connected with the biblical Hagar. The aunt here, again, is usually because of one's age. I was raised in the South, and a young person is not allowed to refer to an older person simply by first name. So you have to add something to it. Mr., Mrs., Reverend, Doctor, something. If the person is a close family member, then it might be aunt, uncle, miss, but you have to add something. You can't just call someone by their first name. So in some instances, the aunt or uncle here is not about family relationships, but rather about respect for someone of a certain age. To find a closer link to Hagar as a black woman, what I found was it was not in perhaps a Negro spiritual that we find an Aunt Hagar figure, but in the blues. So there is a 1920 song called Aunt Hagar's Blues, also called Aunt Hagar's Children and Aunt Hagar's Children's Blues. It was composed by W.C. Handy with lyrics by J. Tim Brim. The lyrics talk about an old deacon who is upset about his congregation dancing and singing and carousing. There is a Hagar figure who is opposed to this. And she says, ain't no use of preaching, ain't no use of teaching. Each modulation of syncopation just tells my feet to dance. And I can't refuse when I hear the melody they call the blues, those ever-loving blues. So in this song, we have Hagar by a different name. The song is set in a church, but Aunt Hagar has nothing to do with the biblical Hagar. While the deacon has a leadership position in the church and opposes singing and dancing, she rebukes him and his teaching. She has to dance. W.C. Handy, himself the composer, in an interview mentions Aunt Hagar's Children's Blues in discussing racial injustice. The interviewer makes a connection with biblical Hagar and says, oh yes, I remember Ishmael. In the interview, he does not pick up her reference, but thinks of Hagar as a progenitor of black Americans. So he explains, I wouldn't wish to say anything that would reflect on my race. This is written to express what every Negro will understand, but which white people of the North could not. You know, sometimes we speak of our race as Aunt Hagar's children. So in the interview, we see here a connection between biblical Hagar and black Hagar. The interviewer is talking about the biblical Hagar, but for Handy, Hagar's children are American Negroes. You may have never heard the song, Aunt Hagar's Blues, but the song was reissued in 1921. And it was also recorded by Lena Horne and included in the W.C. Handy biopic St. Louis Blues. And the song has become a blues and jazz standard. It has been recorded by notables such as King Oliver's Dixie Syncopators, Louis Armstrong and his All-Stars, and the jazz pianist Art Tatum. So the Hagar in the song can exist quite well without any reference to Biblical Hagar. There's nothing there that suggests that that's the connection that they're making. It suggests more strongly that Aunt Hagar and her children are Black Americans who sing and dance and who are the originators of the blues. Novelist Edward Paul Jones published All Aunt Hagar's Children, a collection of short stories, in 2006. He has received the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for his novel The Known World, and within the short story in this collection, he talks about an Aunt Hagar figure. So in responding to a Miss Agatha, who mentions the murder of her son and the lack of investigation, another character responds, if they, meaning the police, if they are doing something, they keeping it secret. One more colored boy out of their hair, it's a shame before God the way they do all Aunt Hagar's children. In an interview with National Public Radio, Jones connects this Hagar with Biblical Hagar. So he recounts, in the Bible, it's Abraham's concubine, his slave. The phrase, all Aunt Hagar's children, is one my mother used for Black people. The novel I wrote, The Known World, was going to be titled Aunt Hagar's Children because when I started it, it was going to be about the Black people that the slave owners owned. But as the years went ahead, the original title didn't work, so I never throw anything away, and I found a use for that title here. The other thing she would say, people weren't Black at that time, they were colored. So it was either colored or all Aunt Hagar's children. It was just a phrase she used. It's along the lines of what Penny says in the title story. She says, all the bad things they do to Aunt Hagar's children. That's sort of the same way my mother would have spoken those words. So again, this is a different Hagar who's unrelated to the Biblical Hagar. There's not an allusion that's clear in her usage, but Jones, knowing of the biblical story, makes the connection between the two, which results in this combined tradition of Hagar. What I found in my work is that an allusion to the name Hagar doesn't always function as a biblical allusion. So a mention of the name doesn't necessarily connect it with the biblical Hagar. The biblical name becomes a shorthand phrase for African American women, and Hagar's children becomes a shorthand phrase for African Americans. In this instance of Hagar, Hagar comes to represent a type of Eve or mother figure for African Americans. This Hagar becomes intertwined with notions of a biblical Hagar and results in a combined tradition of biblical Hagar as a Black woman. So I'll close with a little bit from the epilogue of the book. The purpose of the book really was to discover how and why Hagar becomes Black. There are lots of different ways to possibly tell this story. What my research shows is that interpreters have understood biblical Hagar in a variety of ways. Specifically, linking biblical Hagar with Blackness places the experiences of Black women in conversation with the biblical text, and specifically with the Hagar narratives. Catalyzed by the pioneering work of theologian Dolores Williams, such linkage provides an entry point, particularly for Christian theological engagement that centers Black women. Assigning a particular racial identification to Hagar allows some readers to claim a kinship with her and to more closely identify with her and to the experiences that she has in the text. It appears that when some Black women are choosing to align themselves with this character, it creates a biblical narrative that is inclusive of Black womanhood. Given the historic and ongoing importance of biblical texts, it is understandable how those from marginalized communities would wish to see ourselves reflected in these texts. As different groups have taken texts that have been used to oppress them and found creative ways to reimagine and to repurpose them. In particular, my research shows that it has been often Black scholars and others who have employed ingenious ways to reread and reinterpret biblical texts, despite the use of these texts to support white supremacy. There are different traditions of Hagar rather than a single extended tradition, and both Biblical Hagar and Aunt Hagar have functioned as part of a wondrous African American legacy of biblical interpretation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Apologies for not having a microphone here. Apparently everything shuts down at 5 o'clock, so we couldn't get one. But if we could ask Professor Junior to answer a few questions, I think that we could have a nice and productive Q&A again.
I'm curious, are there any other figures in the Bible that get used like this? Is Hagar unique?
So the question was, are there other figures who get used in this way? What I found was that particularly African American classicist and biblical scholars in their work were not trying to identify, like pick a character and name them as Black, but rather were really just arguing for the importance of Africa in our conversations. So they usually weren't picking out folks, but there are some characters who get selected. So for example, like the Queen of Sheba. People are like, okay, you can have that one. In the New Testament, since it's Easter for some folks, you know, like Simon of Cyrene. All right, I'll grant you that one. Like there are a couple of folks where if it seems like, we'd have to make a case really here, then those characters are sort of permitted in a sense to be thought of as Black. What I was interested in with Hagar is, in some ways, you know, Miriam might be somebody you would think of as a closer fit, or Zipporah, but I didn't see that being an important part of the conversation when I looked at scholarship on those figures. So she does appear to be pretty unique in this respect. Yes?
So what's the earliest representation in the history of art of Hagar? When does it date? What does she look like?
So the question is, what is the earliest representation that we can find, and what does she look like? I actually wasn't looking for like the earliest. What I was looking for was, where can I find when she starts to look a little more brown, as opposed to other figures. In some of the material that we see from like Ethiopia, everybody's figure. I mean, it depends on how you're thinking of her. So sometimes you might see an Abraham and Sarah, but not a Hagar. Yes? So was there a point where things changed? You know, when I share this work with other people, plenty of people are like, I never heard of any of this. Like, I never heard this idea of Hagar being Black. I do think that it is in part in Black communities where you see more of this, and in places where people have read work by Dolores Williams and other scholars. So I'm not arguing for this as much as pointing out some of the ways that I think this tradition might have emerged. But it's not, for people who are familiar, they think, of course. And for people who are not familiar, they're like, I've never heard of this. Yes.
Maybe piggybacking on that a little bit, I'm curious from your perspective what have been any pushback maybe, or a little bit more notable or stickier pushbacks on putting out this idea and this theory. Has anybody challenged you in terms of, oh, well, why is that important? I see why it's important. But I can also tell, how, because it's academia, how certain issues get framed.
Yeah.
Not to push buttons, but to push a button in order to get it to a certain place. I'm just curious how that journey's been for you so far.
Yes. So has there been any pushback, and you know how academics are, any concerns about doing this type of work? So it's been interesting. So the book isn't out yet, so not everybody's had a chance to look at the material. Some pushback I had from a talk I gave that was similar to this, and there was a Muslim woman who was very upset because I had talked about Abraham as someone who had abused Hagar, and that she had been used as a surrogate. And because the text does specify that Hagar became his wife, she felt that there can't be any abuse if you're married, which is problematic in many respects then and now. But I think for some people, they have a particular understanding of biblical figures. And so this challenges and pushes some people to think about Hagar as being in a vulnerable position. Also some pushback in terms of, well, I wouldn't say pushback, but this is work that focuses on Black people and Black readers and not just Black scholars. So I think there's always concerns within one's academic guild about what counts as real scholarship. The presentations I give, people are always anxious when a biblical scholar shows up because they're like, oh my God, is this going to be Greek and Hebrew? I'm not going to understand anything. And I make it a point to try to make it accessible and explain what I'm talking about. This is not the way other people do biblical scholarship. This is my way. It's reception history, but I'm focused not on Hagar through the ages, as often I think is the case with reception history, but asking a really particular question. One of the good things is I have tenure now, so I can kind of do what I want. But I do think that there will be some people who think this is not interesting to me because you're not dealing with the types of literature that I'm used to biblical scholars interrogating. This is uninteresting to me because I don't think literature and art and all this other stuff is really relevant. You should stick to the ancient world. For me, this has been really exciting and interesting. It's also difficult because regular people aren't quoting, they're not citing biblical texts as they're doing what they're doing. So a lot of it is trying to make connections, looking for things. And so I feel like my biblical studies training is being used in the service of this work, but I recognize that there will be people who think, this isn't really what biblical scholars should be doing. That's okay.
You're recentering this form of research outside of the environment.
Yes, these are the people I'm interested in, and I'm interested in these questions, and I say that up front. So it means that there's a lot of material that I just skimmed through and said, oh, they're not talking about race, they're not talking about ethnicity, they're not discussing these questions. Put that in a footnote, let's go over here. Yeah, so this is not, a detailed philological treatment of Genesis 16 and 21. This is not source critical arguments about, the Yahwist and the Elohist. Like, that's just not what I'm interested in. But I will say people outside of the field have been really interested in the work and curious about it.
So along that vein, what are some of the most exciting reactions to this work that you've experienced?
Exciting reactions.
For you.
For me. I think excitement, when I found the interview with Jones, like that was a big day, because I'd been trying to figure out how people were making this connection and putting these different traditions together. So when he spells it out and says, this is the text, but this is what she meant, I was like, that's gold. I'm using that whole quote. I think other people, again, they haven't read it yet, but I think what I've gotten from other people is just like, this is cool. I didn't know you could study Black folks like this. Like, I didn't know this was a thing. I'm interested, I'm curious to know more about this. And people are usually not that interested in biblical studies. Yes.
Two observations. The pictures that you showed early with the white characters, I'm sticking my neck out and suggesting that those are all painted in the 1800s by European artists who may not, I don't know exactly how many African American people they had available to serve as models for them. But at least it suggests to me how it happened that those people were depicted with that skin coloration and other features. The second thing is, many years ago, I visited the Church of the Nazarene in Nazareth, and quite an amazing church, and I remember being so astounded because the windows and other depictions within that church, which had been built, I think, maybe 1960, perhaps, relatively modern church. But the characters of Jesus and Mary were done in multicultural skin tones and cultural dressing and so on. And I remember particularly just being stunned when I looked at one of those images, and it was obviously a Japanese woman in a kimono and an obi carrying a Japanese child, and the Virgin and Jesus were depicted as Japanese characters, and it was quite an epiphany for me to experience that.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, so this is just a selection of images. Some of them are 17th, 18th, 19th century. But I would say that European artists were certainly capable of depicting figures in lots of different skin tones and with lots of different features. Sometimes it was the case that they are working for patrons and people request certain things. Patrons are in the photo, in the images sometimes. But there would have been people available. There would have been lots of different colors of paint that they could have used if they chose to. And we do have depictions of other figures, just not the Hagar figure, but there are depictions of other figures who appear in different hues. The main thing that I just wanted to illustrate was not that these paintings are representative, but I think many of us have seen these kinds of paintings in various places and in even Bibles or other types of things, Sunday school material or other places. And so the point is really just to show how pervasive these types of images are and why it would be so different for there to be other folks who thought of a particular character as a black woman. Yes.
So you trace the use of this term Hagar's children back to W.C. Handy, and from what he was saying too, it sounds like it was a traditional thing to him. Were you able to push it back further than that and get earlier references?
I tried. Again, this is one of the places where people don't use the Bible the way you want them to. So I wasn't able to find anything in print, but it appears that this is common enough that he thinks plenty of people understand it in this way. What I really was trying to show was more that although Williams connects a lot of different Hagars, that there are some related to the biblical text and then some that are unrelated to that. Also in a different chapter in the book, I talk about the pervasiveness of biblical names. That to us today, it might seem the name Hagar must absolutely be related to the biblical one because what other one are you talking about? But in the past, many people would have used biblical names much more frequently than they do today. It doesn't mean that they're making a connection with the biblical text. So people today named David or Paul, you know it's a biblical name. It doesn't necessarily mean that the parents are thinking, this is the future king of Israel. Maybe. Yes?
What was the reason for Ishmael also being sent with Hagar?
Oh, so
Because it was her child, or was it due to like the race? Because you could definitely argue that Sarah wouldn't have wanted to keep the child because it resembled Hagar if she was black.
See, this is when it starts to get juicy, right? So why did Ishmael get kicked out? So in the text, you can read in the handout, Genesis 21, it appears that now that Sarah has a kid of her own with Abraham, she doesn't need Ishmael around. And she sees them playing, and in the Hebrew it's a word play. It's not clear what kind of playing they're doing. So are they like horsing around, like an older child playing with a younger child? Is it inappropriate touching? What's going on? It's not clear. But Sarah's like, oh, they gotta go. They can't stay here. So both of them get kicked out because she already has the kid now of her own, and they're in the way. Yeah, but if you read the text, it would be helpful. There's also, I discuss in another chapter, there are questions about Hagar's status, because some would argue, well, she couldn't have been a regular enslaved woman like an African enslaved person in the US, because of course Sarah would have picked like the best and brightest to be her surrogate. So she wouldn't have like gone out to the field and picked just some random person. This would have been someone of high status, and they connect Hagar in 16 with Genesis 12, where after some drama, Sarah ends up with consolation prizes, including enslaved persons. So part of what some people in the past tried to argue was that She certainly wasn't related to any of this, chattel enslavement going on in the US, because she must have been a very high status, important, lady in waiting, personal assistant, not an actual enslaved person, because Sarah would have wanted a high status woman as a surrogate. Thinking of people who are looking for egg donations frequently look to college campuses because they're looking for a particular profile for someone to do the egg donation. They're not on Craigslist.
Excellent lecture. Thank you so much. I had an earlier question, but something that you said in response to one of the other questions prompted something else. In your research with Muslim people that you've worked with, have you found a resistance with Muslims, among Muslims, to not want to identify Hagar as black or as a darker skin color? Have you found a resistance to that?
This is so complicated. So, long story short, there are traditions that understand Hagar and Ishmael as related to Ibrahim and then to the Prophet Muhammad and that connection. But due to enslavement in earlier periods, the notion of enslavement becomes associated with blackness in a negative way. It's not the same, the categories don't line up the way they do in a US context. But basically, the connections made between Hagar and blackness then are more negative. So there are some Muslim women contemporary scholars who do casually mention Hagar as black or as dark in those ways. Again, not connecting it with US blackness, which is its own sort of thing. So for some folks I've talked to, there's a resistance in the sense of not wanting to use those categories and adding them on top of this story. Usually they want to make sure that I do mention that, and I didn't talk about that here, but in Islamic traditions, Abraham doesn't just kick them out. So in Islamic traditions, Abraham is concerned about Sarah's jealousy. He cares for Hagar and Ishmael, takes them to Mecca, provides for them, even comes back to visit. So it's not as bad as the biblical text where it's like water in a sandwich and you're gone. So there are different traditions of Hagar that people understand different ways. It was hard to explain it all neatly in the book, but I did try to point along the way. There are other things here. I'm just trying to stay focused. Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Do you portray her as a slave in the Quran, or is she a princess or something?
Good question. So Hagar doesn't appear by name in the Quran. There is in Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac is in the biblical text in Genesis and also in the Quran. There's no name for the child. So it's not specified. In the biblical text, it's Isaac, because that comes right after 21 where Ishmael got kicked out. So in 22, in Genesis, it's Isaac who is nearly sacrificed. In the Quran, it doesn't specify a name, is it Isaac or Ishmael, but in tradition, it's Ishmael, who is willing to be sacrificed. We don't get that in the biblical text. But we don't hear anything specific about Hagar by name in the Quran, although she's important in later traditions, including traditions related to the Hajj. Thank you.